certainly one of the great accomplishments of the Edo period was the elimination of war. Well, most war, with the exception of a couple of failed rebellions and disturbances for the Edo period. This also did have some very meaningful consequences for the samurai. First of all, in a world without war, the actual battle readiness of the warriors does start to fade. There is training, and samurai are certainly expected to cultivate themselves physically, to study the application of arms, to study the martial arts, but basically it isn't it's not so much the case anymore that the samurai are really, actually expected to go to war at the drop of a hat, at a moment's notice. That is an element of their identity that they will protect, and they will claim to be warriors and ready to go to war, and certainly many of them were. But basically how prepared a samurai was for that kind of thing became more and more an individual affair. Samurai saw more and more to their training as there were less and less opportunities to practice large-scale military actions with other people from your domain. And so you get the development of really a peacetime bureaucratic class with many warrior traditions, and how seriously you took those traditions really depended on person to person and house to house. The development of firearms is scaled down. It's never stopped. There's all kinds of somewhat silly books being written and saying the Japanese gave up the gun, so to speak. No, they really didn't. But there was no need to develop firearms quite as quickly anymore because you weren't really fighting anyone. But guns still were manufactured, and there was gunnery practice, and some innovative design in gun manufacture was actually carried out at the experimental level. There were also periodic imports of advanced firearms through the Dutch for the Bakufu to study, but really this was not the center of domain concerns anymore. Many samurai turned to what their lords would call debauchery, that is, drinking too much, fighting too much, while being drunk, and for other silly reasons, and just generally becoming soft and not living up to your image as a samurai. And it became more and more the case that higher samurai would be raised in comfort throughout the Edo period, while poorer samurai would be increasingly falling prey to the economic uncertainties of the time, to domination by the merchants, at least the economic domination by the merchants. And so you had a widening gap between the upper samurai and some of their lower retainers. And this would take, a couple of hundred years to really get going. But by the late Edo period, the differences in the lived experiences of the higher and lower samurai would really have some very specific effects on the collapse of Tokugawa rule. Essentially, this collapse would be engineered by younger, poorer samurai. But despite the fact that these were now peacetime warriors, they were still warriors. They thought of themselves as warriors. They had family traditions as warriors. There were certain ways in which violence was still very much a part of samurai life. For example, vendetta and revenge, there was a legally acceptable way of pursuing this. You could actually get permission to carry out a killing of a enemy of your clan. For example, some samurai is passing through town. Maybe he's a masterless samurai, a ronin, or maybe he's a minor retainer of somebody on a procession to Edo, and this guy gets drunk. He's drinking with your father, and he kills your father in a drunken argument and flees. And nobody can find him. So you go to your lord and you say, our family has suffered this injustice. I want to go pursue and kill the offender. The lord may very well say something like, okay, well, is this really what happened? And you get witnesses, and witnesses would say, yeah, this is what happened. Oh, really? And you can't find this guy? And people would say, no, he fled. And then the Lord might very well allow you to leave the domain and to go hunt this guy down. You might be given a pass to ensure safe travels. You might be given a leave of absence from your job if you hold a bureaucratic post. You might even be given a stipend with the understanding that you could only kill this particular person, and then you had to ensure you had to take a number of other actions. You had to provide proof that you had indeed killed him. And so this kind of a way, this kind of a institution of samurai culture certainly very much stems from considerations of honor, considerations of face, of protecting your family, of protecting your clan, and was seen as something that good samurai should be prepared to do if the circumstances were thrust upon them. Another institution in samurai culture that preserved violence was the so-called right of kiriste-gomen, basically the right to cut and leave. That's what it translates into. What this is a law, a samurai law that basically, was different from place to place, but basically it said that the samurai has a right to kill any commoner for being rude to him. Literally, he had that right. Of course, as with many other things during Edo Japan, there is this very harsh law, and there is also the fact that this law was hardly ever actually invoked, because if you kill someone, there's going to be an investigation, and then all sorts of things would come out. Maybe you were both drunk, and if somebody called you a chicken, you was like, oh yeah, I'll show you chicken. I'm not scared of you. Bam. That wasn't just some peasant being rude to you. There were extenuating circumstances, perhaps, and an investigation was generally undesirable, and the public breach of decorum was in and of itself something that was destabilizing to the community, even if you had the legal right to go forth with it. So, a lot of samurai kind of became selectively deaf and chose not to hear insults that were sometimes whispered or maybe even just yelled at them. Some samurai were even induced to back down from physical confrontations from commoners just because it might be not worth their while to, kill this man, which they would have had to do if pressed. There were all sorts of tendencies that mitigated this right of kiriste-gomen, but it was nevertheless a law in the books, was sometimes invoked, and this whole idea that you as a representative of the samurai class had certain duties, many of which involved the application of violence, and these were no less relevant now than they ever were. By the way, this is a scene from a wonderful movie, Revenge, from 1964, which talks about an instance of vendetta and how that was negotiated in samurai society. I love all of the rich samurai movies that we have. And I hope you're enjoying that part of the class. I certainly am. The movie for this week, Harakiri, is certainly one of my favorite movies. There are people who would claim that the Edo period was something of a dark age for samurai culture, how the commoners overtook them in producing these amazing cultural masterpieces, the literature, the theater, all of that. And I think that's greatly overstating the case. Certainly, as we talked about earlier, commoner culture exploded, and the samurai were very interested in it and consumed it very much. This is not to say that samurai culture was in the doldrums at all. It is true that, yeah, the commoners are basically making inroads, but certain traditional samurai art forms, especially the martial arts, no theater, these still survive today, in part because they were genuinely popular among the samurai class, and because many people today know how to engage in kendo, for example, because of that popularity. Speaking of kendo, there were all sorts, this is basically Japanese fencing, there were all sorts of kendo clubs that sprang up all over, especially all over the big cities, Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, but also in domain towns, and they became kind of these focal points for the samurai to go to beat each other over the head with sticks, to prove each other as men, which was certainly very important to this very patriarchal warrior culture, but also places where people talked politics. And so in a way, some of these traditional samurai martial arts still very much had a political importance. Certainly this was the case with architecture. This is a building from a vast complex in north central Japan in Nikko, which is the tomb, the mausoleum of Ieyasu Tokugawa, the first shogun. This main gateway from that compound is absolutely astonishing, and it's just one of many incredibly ornate buildings built on essentially the top of a mountain, set to showcase the power and the authority and the wealth of the Tokugawa family. What is important to keep in mind is that the samurai did patronize commoner art, this commercial art, but they also, at the same time, patronized art in a more traditional manner. That is, they paid great masters to produce art on commission. So these two ways of sponsoring art, the market essentially, and private patronage, really in the Edo period worked together. And just because more and more art was being produced for the market does not mean that art that was patronized by the samurai disappeared. It certainly meant that, just like always, art that was patronized was viewed by far fewer people. If you commission a great folding screen and keep it in your mansion, it's only going to be available to be seen by your guests. But that also fulfilled a traditional role of art, which is to showcase your power and your good taste to your social peers, to other samurai who would be invited into your mansion. Samurai culture is by no means dead. And especially impressive were gains made in scholarship and in intellectual pursuits. Among the samurai class, certainly by other members of Japanese society as well, by commoners as well, but the samurai were at this period expected to be literate. It was a great shame if you were illiterate as an adult. Of course, who would know better than Katsuko Kichi, who was illiterate as an adult and had to teach himself how to read and write? Well, his family locked him in an iron cage for behaving badly. I really, really love Musui's story, so I hope you're looking forward to reading that book. But most samurai certainly were educated enough to be able to read and write, and many of them, not being able to find employment in the bureaucracy of the Tokugawa or of their domains, became essentially school teachers. Schools, so-called terakoya, were a ubiquitous presence in Tokugawa Japan, throughout the cities, in the countryside. Many of them were opened in temples. The word tera means temple, so basically, temple schools. But they could also just be held in any old building. And you'd get people, priests or samurai most often, who would teach young children the Confucian classics. The way that you became educated is you memorized the Confucian classics and could recite them from memory. And that way you were supposed to get all of the moral education that you needed, but also learn how to read and write. So this was a very common way that samurai would supplement their income and remain influential beyond their roles as just warriors. And you can see these are all young boys. All of them have this lock of hair in the front that I was talking about, signifying that they are youths and not adults. And then they would shave it when they became adults. And in these schools, and in the just by virtue of being educated people who liked to talk to other educated people, these samurai made contacts with people outside of their domain, with samurai from outside of their domain, especially in Kyoto, well, in Osaka, but especially in Edo, and also made contact with commoners who went to these schools to receive education from the samurai. The samurai during this period, as in previous periods, but ever more so, became involved in poetry circles, in reading circles, in study circles of all kinds. There were people who got together who appreciated mathematics. There were people who got together who appreciated cooking, and all sorts of things down to Western knowledge, slightly dangerous and very alluring, which I'll talk about in a future slide very shortly. But basically, samurai got to associate with each other and with other members of the Japanese, of Japan, as intellectual beings. So you've seen samurai embrace art and culture during previous periods, and now during the Edo period, you are increasingly seeing the samurai take on another identity as cultural producers, and that is as producers of knowledge, as scholars. Certainly the fact that many of them were now spent a lot of their time in Edo and had lots more books available to them, that helped to push many of them to explore their intellectual interests. And once again, the fact that Japan was now at peace certainly cannot be overestimated. Samurai also got to appreciate people, as I said, from beyond their borders, from beyond the borders of their domain, which greatly expanded their world. And not only with samurai, but also with peasants in the countryside, in their own domains. And from the Edo period, you can really think start to think about the emergence of an imagined community of people in Edo, Japan, who share an increasingly similar culture with each other. And this is the precursor of basically a Japanese national identity. A very influential scholar by the name of Benedict Anderson defined a nation as an imagined community, as a community of people who agree to regard each other as all part of the same group, based on some important characteristic, important to them anyway, common language, common descent, common geographic area. There's a list of possible things to rally around. And certainly an appreciation of common intellectual concerns and a shared language. Certainly a shared language as in, Japanese versus Chinese, but also a shared language as in a shared appreciation for similar kinds of things, such as Confucian thought, for example, really did help to bind Japan together during the Edo period in a way that it had not been before. And much of this was due to technology, increased printing, and so on and so forth. And the samurai were at the forefront of this development and in conversation with many different peoples from all over Japan, their counterparts and commoners as well. Samurai scholarship, as I said, exploded, and knowledge became valued not just because it was useful in government. It had always been valued for that reason, but knowledge increasingly became valued for its own sake. And people, including a great many samurai, in fact, including predominantly samurai, started to experiment with different systems of thought that came to unique conclusions about all sorts of things they were interested in. That's a very broad way of explaining it, but basically saying people became interested in all sorts of things and sought to investigate issues in depth, and a lot of these people were samurai. Here are just a few examples of new thoughts that new schools of thinking during the Edo period that really took off, and they were concerned with slightly different things. Some of them were. Neo-Confucianism, for example. The main advisors of the Tokugawa shogun, the hereditary scholars, rather, of the Tokugawa shogun were members of the Hayashi clan, some of whose works I've had the fortune of reading, who, and people like Arai Hakuseki, basically samurai who were extremely influential because Neo-Confucianism found such a receptive audience in the Tokugawa shogun and at the courts of many of the other daimyo. And essentially Neo-Confucianism, and this is a great oversimplification, but it's basically a re-examination and a simplification of traditional Confucian texts, paring the texts down to what Neo-Confucianists thought was the absolute core of Confucian thought, and basically trying in a much more systematic way to make the moral principles espoused in Confucianism applicable to society. And of course, the same emphasis on vertical structured relationships and things being in their proper place. That was very much a part of Neo-Confucianism. It was an attempt by some of these scholars to remove impurities from Confucianism as they saw them. And this was a very influential intellectual movement that many samurai were very eager to participate in. There was also Kokugaku, so-called national learning, the translation of Kokugaku as national learning, which in many ways stood in opposition to Neo-Confucianism and to Confucianism. People like Motori Norinaga started this ball rolling, and this was in some ways, a manner of thinking that's based on complete misinterpretations of history. Basically, these people believed that Japan is a divine place, that it was built by the gods, and that imports from China, including all of this Chinese culture, including Confucianism, etc., all of that was kind of evil, and that the people of Japan should have nothing to do with anything that came out of China. And of course, as they're doing this, they're writing this in a script and a language which was very heavily influenced by Chinese, and they're very comfortable with Chinese classics and they know them very well. So one has to wonder just how evil they really thought things from China were, but nevertheless Kokugaku is defined by this nativist impulse. And as time went on, it would become a much more influential system of thought, would contribute to the overthrow of Tokugawa rule, and it was certainly something that we can see echoes of during World War II, for example, with this blind faith in the sanctity of Japan and of the imperial household. Or at least, having to pretend you think these people are holy, or the military police are going to come and put you in jail. So Kokugaku definitely had a great impact on intellectual life, but until the late Tokugawa period it remained fairly marginal. There was also Rangaku, so-called Dutch learning. The Japanese word for the Netherlands is Oranda, and so Rangaku, Rang, is the prefix for Oranda, the identifying character for Oranda. Basically, another reading of it is Ran, and Gaku as scholarship or learning. So Dutch learning. People such as Sugita Genpaku, for example, were fascinated, absolutely fascinated by Western, especially scientific thought. And so they did things like transcribe Western anatomy textbooks and publish them in Japanese. And these were revelations for some people who were very eager to find out how the human body works. There were also other scientific conversations going on in the West that these Dutch learning scholars were very eager to be a part of, or very eager to learn of. Advancements in things like gunnery, like optics, medicine, and even the study of foreign languages and foreign philosophy to a limited extent became popular amongst these kinds of scholars. And why all this emphasis on the Dutch? Well, remember, the Dutch are the only Europeans left in Japan who can trade with Japan. And so the language of international communication between Japanese and Westerners for the entirety of the Tokugawa period was Dutch. And these scholars were in many ways influential. Certainly their impact in fields like medicine had a direct impact on the way that people lived during the Tokugawa period. Janarian vaccinations against smallpox, for example, really took off in Japan during the Edo period. But in some ways, it was kind of an almost a demi-monde, almost a kind of a subculture, and at times a very dangerous one, because while at many points daimyo and the Bakufu were willing to tolerate, and in some cases even encourage, particular elements of Dutch learning, they were ever fearful of Christians, and of retainers just learning too much about the outside world and getting funny ideas in their heads. And so sometimes the Bakufu actually launched periodic persecutions of these Dutch learning scholars. Some of them were put under house arrest, some of them were executed. It was really a pursuit in many ways at the whim of the larger political forces in Japan. There was also a very interesting group of people who some historians, including me, call anti-seclusionists, men like Hayashi Shihei and Kudo Heisuke, men who were active at the very end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century, all the way until the collapse of the Edo Bakufu in the 1860s. And these were men who were in many ways unhappy with the maritime prohibitions, people who believed that Japan should spread out and engage with the outside world more deeply. Some of them, including Kudo Heisuke, supported colonizing Ezo, which is known today as Hokkaido. Today we think of Japan as having four main islands: Kyushu, Shikoku, Honshu, and Hokkaido. Hokkaido at this time, as you got from the Hal reading, was mostly foreign land, with the exception of a very small Matsumae domain at the very southern end of it, and most of it was populated by these indigenous Ainu, and people like Kudo Heisuke said, we should really go up there and colonize that place, exploit the mines, exploit the fisheries, and by the way, the Russians will be coming south very soon, which they already had been by that point. That's kind of how this whole conversation got started. More on that next week. But we should really colonize Ezo. There were other people, like his friend Hayashi Shihei, who argued very similar things, who was also, he created maps. This is an astonishingly accurate map of Northeast Asia, centering on Japan, and also somewhat accurately depicting Ezo, which is remarkable because he'd never been there. Hayashi Shihei also argued several other things that were, in a way, troubling for the Tokugawa. He criticized the entire military system of the Tokugawa. He said, look, we're an island country. We don't need a lot of these samurai lords with their great trains of retainers. What we really need are warships. So we should really think about being more like Great Britain, for example, also an island country, also popular, and a great naval power, instead of this, instead of having this military that doesn't meet the needs of the state. And people like Shihei operated in danger of being arrested by the government, certainly censored. There was censorship during Tokugawa Japan. There were controls over what you could print. And some people who had ideas that might conflict with the official line of the Tokugawa government, they were better at communicating their views to other people than were some other people. Let's take Kudo Heisuke and Hayashi Shihei, for example. Kudo Heisuke was somebody who was had a little bit more tact. He knew people in high government positions, as did his friend Hayashi. But what Kudo did is, through back channels, he wrote a very important treatise which survives to this day, and outlining some of these ideas that I've been talking about. And through back channels, he kind of leaked this to one of his acquaintances, none other than Grand Chamberlain Tanuma Okitsugu, who read Kudo's proposals and rather liked them. Tanuma was later forced out of power for an unrelated scandal, so you never did see large-scale colonization of Ezo during this period, as Kudo had recommended, but at least he didn't really get in trouble for believing all of these radical things, even though it became fairly clear that he was that he did hold these views. He went through back channels. Hayashi Shihei, however, wrote his ideas down and published them illegally, and was placed under house arrest because he just didn't do that. You did not make the Tokugawa look bad in public by criticizing their military system in print. Excuse me. So I hope that this discussion gives you some appreciation for the new and very, very rich intellectual world that the samurai were starting to inhabit, and this world is absolutely a product of the Edo period, and there's a reason we did not see anything like it in previous times.